I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kid Straight Mom. Today we're talking about all of the legislation that's going on that's targeted towards specifically transgender people. A good source I found, if you want to check in on some of this stuff, is translegislation.com. According to this site, and you can kind of track things by state and see what the status of different bills is. But in 2025, 796 bills are under consideration across the country that would negatively impact trans and gender nonconforming people.
That's wild. I don't even know how to do that math. How many is that per state?
I don't know, but I can tell you that the top two states are Texas with 124 and Missouri with 64. Education is the number one area of impact. So, like what these have to do with or will affect. And then healthcare is second. As of now, 39 have passed, 42 have failed, and 29 of those 39 that have passed have been signed into law. So I guess it's positive that more have failed than passed if we're going to try to look for a bright side. But that's a lot. That is a lot of bills, considering especially that transgender people make up roughly 1% of the population. If that, there's also some information on the ACLU's website. Although I didn't really have time to dig into what they're measuring that's different. They said they are tracking 527 anti-LGBTQ bills. So I don't know if the trans legislation website is just, drawing more connections between like this will affect trans people, even if it's not like directly targeted at them. But regardless, that's a lot. So I, being me, had to dive a little bit into the psychology behind anti-trans legislation. Because why, right? Why is there so much energy behind attacking such a small part of the population? And I found a fascinating article that I will link to, of course, on the website. In this article, these psychologists say that the reasons that people usually give for being anti-trans center on protecting children, protecting cisgender women's rights in bathrooms and sports competitions, and on removing funding for gender-affirming care. So those are like apparently the things people are most worried about.
Which is funny because those are all just like, why? Why again? Why? I feel like a small child. Okay, but why?
Yeah, exactly. Protecting children from what? Protecting women in bathrooms from what?
Taking away help people's health care. Why?
Yeah.
What's the benefit? Who does this help?
Right. Well, the why, in part, appears to stem from fear-driven motives that are not supported by evidence, but fears aren't always rational.
For instance, spiders are wonderful.
See, anyway, this article discusses a natural human tendency to have inherent negative feelings toward people who aren't part of your in-group, kind of going way back through the history of human beings and like that need to have your group for protection and whatever, suspicion toward outsiders. And so for some people, a transgender person's status as trans might be the most notable thing about them that stands out, that makes them different. And so they are automatically in the out group for a lot of people, not part of the mainstream. They're different. And so out group bias will be directed toward them. Anti-trans feelings may also come from the fear that transgender people pose threats to one's personal or group identity. Gender is part of everyone's identity. And if somebody like strongly holds the belief that their gender is determined by their biological sex, they might feel that people that sort of violate that rule are a threat to their identity.
You know what we call that? Fascism. And I should be really clear because a lot of people will sort of glibly call things fascism in a way that I think really dilutes the power of, what fascism actually is and how. But no, that's fascism. Fascism is rooted on, giving people an enemy and saying, we are the true nation or the true nation state. They are the enemy. We must fight against them.
From a policy perspective.
Right.
Right. So, like, yeah, it's saying that the country is made up of these different in groups, like self identified in groups. And when you make these laws, you're sort of validating the group that says we're the ones that's right. And they're the out group, which is kind of interesting. I've never thought about fascism in that way, but that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. That is when the government says that your group, we agree with you that your group is right.
Right. And actually, this reminds me, I have an excerpt of an essay to read. I read this for a class recently. It's the introduction that Zadie Smith wrote to Toni Morrison's only short story, Recitatif, which is a very interesting short story. And it's, worth everybody going and reading, just like for what it is, because it's interesting. But there's also a part where Zadie Smith then goes on to cite Toni Morrison's summary of oppressive structures and fascist governments and how they're built. And so what she says is, let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, even a third. The move towards a final solution is not a jump. It takes one step, then another, then another. Something perhaps like this. 1. Construct an internal enemy as both focus and a diversion. 2. Isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and coded name-calling and verbal abuse. Employ ad hominem attacks as legitimate charges against that enemy. 3. Enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonizing process because it is profitable, because it grants power, and because it works. 4. Palisade all art forms, monitor, discredit, or expel those that challenge or destabilize processes of demonization and deification. 5. Subvert and malign all representatives of and sympathizers with this constructed enemy. 6. Solicit from among the enemy collaborators who agree with and can sanitize the dispossession process. 7. Pathologize the enemy in scholarly and popular mediums. Recycle, for example, scientific racism and the myths of racial superiority in order to naturalize the pathology. 8. Criminalize the enemy. Then prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of holding arenas for the enemy, especially its males and absolutely its children. 9. Reward mindlessness and apathy with monumentalized in entertainments and with little pleasures, tiny seductions, a few minutes on television, a few lines in the press, a little pseudo-success, the illusion of power and influence, a little fun, a little style, a little consequence. 10. Maintain at all costs silence. Again, that is Toni Morrison being quoted in Zadie Smith's essay, The Genius of Toni Morrison's only short story in The New Yorker. But yeah, I think we can all see that we're doing all those things.
When was that written?
That was an address to Howard University in 1995.
Huh. That's alarming.
Right. And we should think about the fact that not only are those things all happening with trans people, but they're happening with multiple different groups. I think the most obvious one is immigrants, which is what I thought of when I read the one about, constructing holding facilities. Reboot Guantanamo Bay, anyone? Like, if anyone has not heard about some of the immigrants and permanent residents and tourists and workers who have been detained by the Trump administration, I would really recommend looking into that because it is very disturbing and we should all be very upset.
It's definitely troubling. Obviously learning that there are deep-seated and psychologically explained reasons for this stuff. A role of the government should be to protect people from like the worst impulses of people, right?
Right. Like everyone, the entire basis of social contract theory, which is where the United States government comes from, is that we sacrifice some of our freedoms to be protected from how horrible a state of nature is, at least according to one interpretation by Thomas Hobbes, where he's like, life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We don't want a solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short life. So we have a government. The government's responsibility is not to magnify our worst impulses.
Unfortunately, that seems to be where we are with, that sort of group identity and the way that it treats outsiders, which, can obviously be applied, like you said, to immigrants as well. And I guess, kind of all of this because it's, psychological explanations for treating people badly. But another part of it is illusory correlations. where people think that because two things happened at the same time, one causes the other. And so if you only ever hear about a transgender person that committed a crime or an immigrant that committed a crime, and that's, very intentionally only the only information that's being provided to people, they start to think that there's actually a relationship between those things. And so we've obviously seen that lately a really strong tactic of Trump and the people around him is to just create sometimes really out of the blue negative associations between groups of people and supposed behaviors like eating the cats and dogs, right? And confirmation bias, of course. If you think that transgender people are dangerous, you might search for crimes committed by transgender people. And then you're going to find a list of like every obscure thing that a transgender person has ever done that was a crime and be like, oh my gosh, look at all of these crimes. Even though if you looked at every crime committed by cisgender people, it would go on forever. These are a lot of the things, the forces going on inside of people that lead to, strong enough feelings about this that they will support anti-trans legislation, even though, like I said, it's, not really a significant issue for most of the population. However, when it comes to transgender people, a study by the Williams Institute at UCLA found for the 2024 anti-transgender legislation that 93% of transgender youth ages 13 to 17 in the US, an estimated 280,300 people, live in states that have passed or proposed one or more laws banning access to gender-affirming care, participation in sports, use of bathrooms and other sex-separated facilities, or affirmation of gender through pronoun use. So even though it's a tiny, tiny part of the population, of that population, almost everybody is being affected by this. Clearly, that's going to take a toll on a group of people. A handful of states, I believe Washington State actually has legal protections for transgender people, but in most places, it's a pretty vulnerable place to be, especially, I guess, as a reaction to losing this past presidential election. It seems like some Democrats are like blaming this issue and wavering on actually supporting transgender rights. So that process is even more tenuous in states that don't have protections already. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which my understanding is not like a super conservative group, just ruled that Idaho can ban transgender students from using bathrooms that align with their gender identity. They said that cisgender students' privacy concerns over the harm faced by transgender students outweighs the safety concerns of trans students. So it effectively strips them of Title IX protections in school facilities.
I'm going to sue the state and tell them that it's a violation of my privacy concerns to have to use shared bathrooms ever. And I would like all public facilities to be required to construct just like a bunch of single stall bathrooms because there, problem solved. Boom.
I know. It would solve the problem. It does seem like there's a little bit of a shift right now towards leaning against the trans community.
Frankly, it's a shift towards Democrats not acting like they care about anyone at all. If any Democratic strategists are listening to this podcast, hit us up. We have ideas. We have thought on how to not do what you're doing right now. Yeah, I mean, it's because it's a widespread problem. Obviously, trans people are a particularly vulnerable group of people, and that's why we're focusing on them. But again, like it's a trend that is affecting everybody, especially immigrants, not having politicians standing up for them, affecting protest rights. If you look at the rules Colombia just implemented because it was worried that it was going to lose all this money from the federal government, not letting protesters wear masks, et cetera, et cetera. It's affecting anybody who gets Social Security payments or gets their health care through the government. Like, it's everyone. And there have been a lot of examples of Democrats just demonstrating really no interest in standing up for any of these issues, which is really problematic.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just like parties in free fall or what. It's not encouraging. It's time to do something different.
Again, we have ideas, please.
We do have ideas. In fact, we're going to have an episode coming up where we talk to some other, young people from the LGBTQ plus community about some of those ideas. Not wanting to leave this on a completely negative note, even though it's pretty negative. There are some little bits of optimism. There are a few good things that have happened. The Senate Democrats just voted unanimously to block a Republican-led bill that would prohibit federally funded schools from allowing trans athletes to participate in women's sports. Given what we just said, I'm glad that they voted unanimously on that.
Yes, more of that, please.
Minnesota rejected a bill that would have banned trans girls from playing school sports. In Montana, a bill, this is so horrifying to me, a bill to remove trans children from their parents and one banning drag shows were defeated after passionate speeches from trans lawmakers S.J. Howell and Zoe Zephyr, who has been on our show a couple of times. 13 Republican lawmakers kind of flipped on this to vote against those bills, which is really a bit of hope. And I think kind of supports that idea that, you know, people say that actually knowing a transgender person can really make a difference. Obviously not in some of the treatment of Sarah McBride, but you know, maybe in places like Montana where there's still kind of a sense of like community. I don't know.
For all we know, there are people who are being like, wow, interesting to know an actual trans person in Congress. And it's really making people like Nancy Mace look extra unhinged to be shouting slurs on the floor. So, you know.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's just a process. And, you know, the fact that people in Montana and the legislature know Zoe Zephyr now and know that she's, you know, because she has been there before and she's a reasonable, level-headed person. You know, maybe that helps as you build a reputation. You know, these Republican lawmakers are just like, these are just people who are like us. Hopefully. I thought that was an exciting development, especially in a state like Montana.
I would highly encourage everyone, especially if you live in a district in any state represented by a Republican who has voted against an anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ plus bill, to, but also Democrats, right? Everybody, to, you know, send them a letter, email, phone call, whatever, thanking them for their support, you know, so that they're positive reinforcement.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important to let those people know that when they stand up for that kind of stuff, that it is meaningful to people. One other like good thing that's happening somewhere on January 22nd, Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan signed a law expanding the state's protected classes to include sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, physical or mental disability, age, and ethnicity. Hopefully that will help because I am starting to see some, like Michigan is one of the states that is having some bills attacking trans rights. So we'll see how all of that plays out. It's not all bad, but a lot of it's bad. But like I said, translegislation.com is a great place to learn more about what's happening. Check out what's happening in your states, find out who's introduced the legislation, maybe tell them how you feel about it. Keep track of who's voting for and against things. And like Sienna said, like feedback. Just kind of important to know that this stuff is going on and I guess be an active participant in democracy for as long as we still have it.
Yeah, you know, the other day in class, we were having a conversation about the value of nonviolent protest and revolution. And the teacher referenced one of the most commonly cited examples of when nonviolence would not have worked. And that was in the case of Nazi Germany. Like, well, what's America going to do? Be like, please don't kill people? Like, you know, that's always cited as an example of when military intervention is considered morally correct. But here's the thing. There was an opportunity for nonviolence way before World War II actually broke out. Like German citizens had the chance to reject the Nazi party and, you know, not allow the Holocaust and the preceding policies to happen. And they made the choice not to, kind of collectively. And that's why World War II ended up happening, right? On a very, very simplistic level. So, like, don't wait that long. Don't let people exploit your grievances. Don't let people tell you it's because of the economy. Like, we have an obligation to stand up for people and for our own civil rights. And you can't just draw a line and then keep moving the line backwards and saying, well, it's not that bad yet. It doesn't really require that yet. Like, no, get on board right now because it's important.
Right. There's your call to action. Let's try not to get to that place again. Get involved, find out what your community is doing, who's pushing back and how, and what you can do to help. Hopefully, we can at least start to turn the tide or stem the tide or something other than what's happening right now. There's a lot of bad news. I mean, I feel like every morning I kind of do a scroll and I just like want to pull the covers over my head and go back to sleep because it's a lot of bad stuff. But there are a lot of people working and showing up, trying to make things better. So just remember that. Just remember that there are a lot of people who do care and that they don't always have the loudest voices, but hopefully the arc of history does turn towards justice. I guess we shall see. I guess we all just do what we can and keep your head above water. Hopefully, everybody can find something that's fun, lighthearted, entertaining to take your mind off of the news at least a little bit every day, or get outside or move.
Or if you want to be sad in a completely new and exciting way, the new Hunger Games book is out.
Which really could go either way because it could be a distraction or it could just be like, now I'm starting to lose track. Was that thing I read earlier today in the Hunger Games book or was it in the news?
It really is. It's like, it's funny because like Suzanne Collins does not talk about politics explicitly a lot, but you read this book and you're like, I see what you're talking about here. Anyway, this is not a paid advertisement because no one pays us to advertise anything. I just started reading it and it's good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it too. I'm reading Somewhere Beyond the Sea, the sequel to The House on the Cerulean Sea, and it's very entertaining. Kind of just like relevant and sad in sort of the same ways that we are talking about, but also, just like having these things handled with a light touch and a sense of humor can be helpful. So I would also recommend that. If anybody else has a show or a book or music or anything else that's helping you get through the day these days, let us know. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram, and Threads at queerkid.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at Queer Kid Straight Mom. We are no longer on Twitter.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.